To what extent do you think a historian can either prove or disprove the resurrection of Jesus?
I think that the arguments for an empty tomb are slightly better than those on the other side.
Alex O'Connor asking a historian, what is the likelihood of Jesus actually rising from the dead? And this historian gives amazing responses and actually some pretty non-biased responses in my opinion. And I think this is just going to be very interesting, and I'm going to be giving my commentary all the way through. Let's get right into it.
To what extent do you think a historian can either prove or disprove the resurrection of Jesus?
So if by history you mean that you can prove that God raised Jesus from the dead, then I don't think so. I think that's mixing two categories, theology and history. I think the historian can say certain things. The historian could say, for example, the tomb was probably empty or the tomb probably wasn't empty. That's independent of a theological judgment. You can also make arguments about who maybe saw Jesus or thought they saw Jesus. But part of the theme of my book is that apologists and skeptics typically reach too far. So while I start out the book by saying I'm perfectly happy to say as a Christian, I think God raised Jesus from the dead, this is not something that I could prove historically to other people. There are parts of the New Testament or claims in the New Testament that we can address as historians. But
Right. I don't think anyone is out here saying we have complete 100% proof. I can prove to you right now that Jesus resurrected. But there's pretty amazing evidence. Like, when you put all of the details together, it's just the evidence is pushing towards the resurrection.
Of the day, I think the skeptic can be reasonable as a skeptic. I think the Christian can be reasonable as a skeptic. And it's just the case that history does not give people as much as they want. So the skeptic wants to be able to say it's ridiculous to think that anything happened here. The apologist wants to say, well, I can show this, that, and the other thing. And the best hypothesis for that is that Jesus rose from the dead or God raised Jesus from the dead. I'm in the middle on this one. I just don't think either side is persuasive. I actually think at the end of the day that people's worldviews are configuring the data, whether they know it or not. But I also think the data is pliable enough that it can be configured reasonably in more than one way. Again, that will depend on your worldview.
Yeah, your book, The Resurrection of Jesus, is a masterclass of scholarship, and I recommend it to everybody who has even a passing interest in Jesus and Christianity. But people will listen to what you've just said and think, okay, I understand that you can't historically prove a resurrection. You can't sort of, look through the lens of history and see Jesus walking out of the tomb. But we can know certain things with a level of certainty that is standard of historical reporting. So ideas like Jesus was crucified, he was put to death by the Romans on a cross. Ideas like his early followers started to believe that they'd seen him after they died. Facts like the persecution of early Christians. Christians will point to things like this and say that these are historical facts, and although
Exactly, and then we would be like, I think those things are pushing towards Jesus' resurrection. Obviously, something happened. What they were saying either is a truth or a crazy lie and something that they're willing to die for. And now we know, I guess, that not every disciple, we don't have 100% proof that these disciples all died. But most likely they all got persecuted. And some of them almost most definitely did die.
Prove a resurrection, we can look to the resurrection as the best explanation of those facts. What do you think of that approach?
So first of all, you are correct, although I would add that there's always a spectrum here. That is, some things are more probable than others. Some things are highly unlikely. Some things are highly probable. Some things in the middle are 50-50. So not everything is the same. Not everything is like Jesus was crucified. I think that's a slam dunk. I think that everybody should agree with that. But when it comes to
Right.
something like the empty tomb, there are arguments on both sides. I think that the arguments for an empty tomb are slightly better than those on the other side, but that's not a slam dunk. And I realize I could be wrong, and I know reasonable people disagree with me. It's the same thing for Joseph of Arimathea. I am conservative, I guess, about this one. I think it likely that somebody named Joseph of Arimathea had something to do with the burial of Jesus. But again, there are well-informed, good-hearted people on the other side who take a different view. So part
I
of
would like to know, why in the world would someone take a different view on that? Like, what evidence? There wasn't a Joseph of Arimathea who buried Jesus. Do they think, oh, based off of the Romans and all the historians during that time, they just threw all the bodies into the scripture? These manuscripts are saying, no, this man named Joseph of Arimathea took him, put him in a tomb.
my problem is that I don't think in terms of uh, yes or no. I think in terms of a scale of probability and and with regard to things having to do with the resurrection of Jesus, there is a scale here. So I can tell you what I think is probable, but then I would also have to sit back and say, well, is this highly probable or just a little bit better than 50-50? That sort of thing. Um, but again, so let's say as an historian you decide the tomb was empty. Well, what do you do with that? We really do know that there were people who robbed tombs in antiquity, not just for whatever wealth might be in them, but people used bodies for different purposes. And we have lots of markers from antiquity on graves in the Roman world, Greek world, Jewish world, which tell people not to enter here and not to remove bodies. The reason they're there is because people did move bodies.
You really think, though, that someone stole the body? Someone stole the body with guards there? Guards at the tomb? That is highly unlikely, in my opinion. Not unless they don't think the guards were there, but the Bible says they were.
We also know from magical papyri that sometimes people used body parts and sometimes pieces of humans who died violently in an incantation recipe, for example. So the point is, we do know that people stole bodies. Some people like to steal bodies of people who died violently. So how can the Christian or anybody show how the tomb got empty? I think that we're often trapped in a sort of Sherlock Holmes narrative where if we're smart enough, we can figure it out. But I don't think that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence for whatever it is you want to say about the New Testament. So my own view is that people who are going to affirm that Jesus rose from the dead aren't going to be doing it on historical grounds. By the way, just as a matter of fact, that's not why most Christians who go to church, think Jesus rose from the dead, or why they profess that. They didn't spend time studying all the data disinterestedly
True.
and conclude, oh yeah, it's more likely than not. That's not what happened. The way to think about this is that the resurrection of Jesus for a Christian is part of a worldview. It serves a function within this worldview. It has certain theological functions, and it's sort of, so to speak, the whole picture that's going to make this welcome, or the whole.
I wouldn't just say it's part of a worldview that made people Christians. I would say, yeah, it's not 100% the evidential side for people to become a Christian. A lot of times it's the relational side, the experience side, something miraculous God has done in their life, and therefore they want to commit themselves to Jesus. I would say that's a major difference. The supernatural experience, they see something that is completely out of their explanation and out of how they see the world and they look into which God. I mean, then coming from an atheistic worldview, I do think the Christian God is the most logical and reliable religion, like based off of the evidence.
Sure, if you have a different worldview, that's going to make it unwelcome. And it's very rare, I know some people, but it's very rare for somebody to say, I don't care whether Jesus rose from the dead or not. I'm not interested. I just like to look at the data and see what it says. But I am convinced that at the end of the day, you will be disappointed because there is nothing in the ancient sources that shows you that the Christians must have been totally deluded. But there's nothing there that shows you they must have been 100% correct. Just think of other events in the Gospels. How do you prove that a bunch of pigs at some point in Jesus' ministry went off a cliff? How do you show that? Well, that's a miracle story. It's very interesting. If it happened, people would remember it. But there's no way to prove it. It's just a text in a book surviving from antiquity. And I don't know how anyone could say that never happened. I don't know how you could disprove the story.
Right.
I don't know how you can prove the story. So there are things involved with the resurrection of Jesus
that's very interesting, because a lot of atheists will be like, you have no proof for this. You can't tell me this is true or not. Well, how are we supposed to show you 100% proof for something that happened 2,000 years ago? How? So don't go on asking for proof like this scientific data that we can prove 2 + 2 is 4. No, we can't do that. I still think there's amazing evidence.
I don't think you can prove. Now, having said that, I actually am conservative here as an historian. I think Jesus probably was buried. I don't think he was thrown in a pile or left up on a cross. I think he was buried. It's kind of mysterious to me, but again, I think somebody named Joseph of Arimathea was involved. This is not just a total fabrication. I also am inclined to think that some people went to visit Jesus soon after his crucifixion, which is what people do with the recently dead. They go visit the graves soon afterwards when they can, and for whatever reason, they found it empty. I also argue in the book that the belief Jesus rose from the dead wasn't something that sort of gradually developed over 6 months through reflection and thinking about Old Testament text. I think it was probably there from the first week. So if you add all these things together, you'll say, well, I'm very conservative and traditional about these things, but there are two problems. One is that I hedge my bets. I don't know these things. I think they're more probable than not, more likely than not, and I recognize others disagree. I also don't see how one can put these together and just say Jesus rose from the dead, or that's the best explanation.
Why not? I mean, obviously, maybe if there is no God, if you just strictly think about if there is no God, okay, fine. Maybe there's a better explanation, as in someone stole the body. Okay, whatever. But if there is a God, and also all the disciples completely transformed themselves, they literally became super unashamed of the gospel, not afraid of dying, not afraid of getting persecuted for whatever reason after Jesus died and then resurrected.
Don't think you have to be an imbecile to think, well, one possibility is that there were tomb robbers and then a couple of people hallucinated Jesus and that got the ball rolling. I think you can make some sort of case like that if you want to.
What?
So that's why
I don't think so. Based off of just a few people having hallucinations, but people are saying 500 people saw him.
Both sides dislike what I'm doing here, because I'm not saying this is all obviously legendary from beginning to end, and I'm not saying, obviously we can show all this happened and draw theological conclusions or say Jesus rose from the dead.
I do respect that to some degree. Like, I appreciate, well, this is what I see and that's what I have. That's it.
I just don't see that. So On the one hand, I seem to be conservative. On the other hand, I'm a skeptic with regard to how far you can carry your interpretation
Well,
just from the data, just from the data
I
alone.
myself, I love what you're doing for that reason, because yeah, I'm not a Christian, but like you, I think that it's not like a mark of intelligence which side you fall down on this. It's quite clearly irresolvable when you look at it from a historical perspective. But despite that, it is incredibly interesting, and there are so many avenues that you can dive into and considerations that don't immediately spring to mind when you read these texts. So one, for example, that I hadn't even really thought about until I read your book was about the list of appearances that we're told about. We're told that Jesus appears to Peter. We're told that he appears to the 12. We're told, in a few narrative cases, we're told about the road to Emmaus, doubting Thomas. And what struck me is when you pointed out that Peter, who is the most important of the apostles of Jesus, or at least of the original 12 disciples, and presumably will have had one of the most important, maybe even one of the first visions of Jesus, every time the appearance to Peter is mentioned, it's just kind of brushed over. Of course, Paul famously says that he appeared to Cephas as part of his whole scheme, but that makes sense. He's just listing names. But even in the gospel accounts, it's just something that's mentioned. And interestingly as well, at the end of Mark's gospel, the short ending, before you have the stuff that was added on later, you have this instruction to go and tell Peter and the disciples. Whereas when it gets to Matthew's gospel, the angel says, go and tell the disciples. It doesn't specify Peter. So what do you think's going on with Peter and the appearance to Peter specifically in the resurrection narratives?
So if I had to bet, I wouldn't bet against 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. Paul, I think, is passing on a tradition, and I see no reason to doubt it. And Paul himself in Galatians indicates that he spent time with Peter, so he must know some things about Peter. I have a suspicion, of course you can't prove it. There have been all sorts of theories. Maybe later maybe there was something in the account that was regarded as heretical, for example, and so it dropped out. There are all sorts of possibilities here. But one possibility, which I don't think I've ever found in the literature, but it seems to be a good possibility, is that Peter had a vision of Jesus or saw him briefly, and that was it. That is, nothing was said, and there was no story to tell. That is, he appeared to Peter would be the end of the narrative. So it's nothing from which you could have a story develop. Now, one of the things I do in my book is I take seriously these reports from all times and places of people having encounters with the newly departed, thinking that somebody has come back and that they see this person. Well, most of them are brief, and most of them don't involve any verbal communication. So if Peter had a vision or something like a vision, there wouldn't be any story. It's just, I saw him.
What about, though, the claims that they ate with Jesus, talked with Jesus? All the senses were going on, not just a vision or seeing someone. What about that,
So I can't prove that. I don't know how likely or probable it is. But you're right, it seems weird that you get a story about Mary Magdalene, of all people, right? And then you get the story about the appearance to the 12, but nothing about Peter. So all we can do is guess. But I think the scenario I just gave you is a plausible guess.
So that's absolutely fascinating. Go check out the rest of Alex O'Connor's video, praying for Alex O'Connor that he comes to know Jesus as his Lord and Savior. I think that would be incredible, and I know that he's seeking, I believe. I think it's super cool that he makes awesome content, and even though he's a skeptic, he seems reasonable for the most part, and I love watching his journey. So I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments below, whatever that may be. And if you've never decided to follow Jesus, I encourage you to do that for the first time. In the description below, you can click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. I encourage you to do that today.